effects. There's lots of, oops, I didn't start the recording will now miss my random introduction. So there's lots of definitions of maternal effects in the literature, but the one that I prefer and that we've come up with is talking about maternal effects as just this general idea of a causal influence of the maternal genotype or phenotype on offspring phenotype. So it's the influence that mothers have on traits in their offspring, in a sense. And a lot of times what you'll see is that people will define these based on how you identify them. But to me, what you want to do is you want to define something like maternal effects or gene interactions or any of these other concepts as something that's conceptually consistent, and then worry about how you might actually identify them empirically. That's a separate problem, right? This is a phenomenon, then you need methods to go out and find that phenomenon, as opposed to identifying something as something that you find in an analysis. So again, maternal effects are this general idea of the causal influence, something that mothers do that influence traits in their offspring. And I should have said at the beginning, I have things I can drop or add as we go, so I don't mind being interrupted. I'm not sure how everyone is comfortable with that, but I'm perfectly comfortable with just dropping things to go back to things you don't understand. So maternal effects come from a lot of things. If you were to ask a developmental biologist or a lot of molecular biologists, they would probably talk about maternally derived RNAs, possibly proteins, hormones, or even nutrients that are put into eggs or seeds. But developmental biologists would probably focus on something like the direct RNA contribution that mothers make through maternal effect genes. But of course, these can be really general, phenomenon where you have any kind of maternally constructed or determined environment, things that happen through the nest or the uterine environment, dispersal-based traits in a lot of organisms, especially plants, where mothers do something that determine where their offspring are going to end up, and things like oviposition site in that same vein. And of course, they arise from a lot of maternal behaviors as well, through things like grooming, nutrient provisioning via placenta and lactation. And so if you look across sort of diversity of organisms, especially animals, you see that they arise through a lot of different phenomena. So here's just sort of a smattering of different organisms to give you a sense of the kind of places we think maternal effects come from. And so, why are they important? Well, one of the major things is that if you look at traits, especially traits expressed early in development, but not necessarily only traits expressed early in development, maternal effects are often one of the most important, if not the single most important determinant of offspring phenotype and offspring fitness. And since early survival is often the largest component of variation in lifetime fitness, maternal effects therefore can be thought of as this phenomenon that has a huge effect on the traits that are under the strongest selection, because they're determining much of the variation in lifetime fitness, that is early survival. And so I'm going to focus almost entirely on the genetic consequences, because as an evolutionary geneticist, that's my interest. And of course, because any of these things that mothers do can ultimately have a genetic basis, you can think about them arising as an influence of maternal genotype on offspring phenotype, and therefore they're part of genetic architecture. So this is what we think of as an indirect mapping from genotype to phenotype. Genes in the mother mapping to traits in the offspring, and I'll come back to that concept in a moment. And one of the things that's particularly interesting with maternal effects is individuals experience some environment, like the nest environment, then they're related to the environment in a sense. They have genes that are related to the individual who created the environment for them. So you have this correlation between the genes you have and the environments you experience, because the genes you have indirectly cause the environment you experience through the actions of your mother. And so if we think about that sort of now conceptually by making this formal, if we take the offspring phenotype, and I think was it Jim who also used the Z for offspring phenotype, and here we're just going to talk about the genes that the individual has and the environment that they experience. That's the classic quantitative genetic partitioning of genes in the environment. But with maternal effects, we want to think about, well, there's a specific part of this environment that's actually special, that it's provided by the mother. So we can separate that and still have some random environment that we're not interested in. And of course, this environment provided by the mother is ultimately the consequence of some traits expressed by the mother, or genes expressed by the mother. And so you have genes and environmental influences on the mother that cascade to influences on the offspring through this maternal effect. So this would be the maternal effect here, where the mothers end up influencing traits in the offspring. And so that's what we call the maternal genetic effect. Genes in the mother map to the phenotype of the offspring through this pathway, right? So through the fact that they ultimately influence the mother's gene phenotype, that mother makes some environment or passes something on to the offspring that influences their phenotype. So that's the maternal genetic effect, which is what I'm going to focus primarily on. One of the things that's important to consider when we think about maternal effect models is that the genes exist in one generation, but the effects exist in a different generation. And so that has a lot of implications for evolutionary consequences, that you're looking at the influence in the current generation of genes that were expressed in the previous generation. So you have this disconnect between when genes are expressed and when the phenotype is seen. And that's this separation here. So that's essentially, in words, what I've just said. And we could write that as an equation, which gives us, we're moving to the quantitative genetics world, where again the offspring phenotype is a function of their genes, the environment that they experience, and then some property of mothers that's expressed in the previous generation. So in this case, we would call this general maternal effect, what we call maternal performance. And that was what was the focus of a lot of quantitative genetic theory for a long time, which is just a general, the maternal effect is this term here. It is the influence of mothers on their offspring. And that's what we call maternal performance. So of course, maternal performance or maternal effect can have a genetic basis. So if we were to take that term, right, so we have the maternal phenotype here, this maternal effect or maternal performance, that itself has genetic effects and environmental effects. And it can also be influenced by maternal effects, but let's just ignore that and just say that there's something about mothers that influences something else about their offspring. And so again, that's this general view of maternal performance having its own genetic basis and its own environmental basis. And so I write this out to say as we go along, you have to keep in mind that we're talking about something about mothers that we'll call maternal performance or a maternal effect, and a different trait in their offspring that we're thinking about in terms of how do mothers influence their offspring. And so if you wanted to, and then this has been sort of what's developed more recently in terms of our understanding of maternal effects, you could ask about how do certain maternal traits influence offspring traits. So you could say, well, I want to know what is the phenotype of the offspring given some trait I measured in the mothers. And so this could be something like the amount of milk the mother gives, and it has an effect of size M on the phenotype of the offspring. And so that's a sort of trait-based view, and this comes from the Kirkpatrick and Landy 1989 model that I can give you the full reference for if you want, where this little parameter here says, well, instead of thinking about maternal effects as just the overall influence of mothers on offspring, let's think about how different traits in mothers affect this specific trait in offspring so we can measure that. And of course, mothers express a whole bunch of traits. So if you wanted to know, ultimately, say something about size at weaning in a mammal here, you'd say, well, there's a whole bunch of traits in mothers, like the amount of milk they produce, maybe the amount of the type of nest and characteristics of the nest they produce, and each of those has some effect on growth and development of the offspring that's realized in the size of the offspring at some point in time. This whole term here, when we add together all the different types of influences that the mother has on her offspring through all the different pathways, this is ultimately what we call maternal performance. So this idea that what's the overall influence of mothers on offspring that people have worried about for a long time can be broken down into the influence of all sorts of different individual maternal traits in a view like this. And I'm not going to use this, what I think is a slightly more complex view, this sort of trait-based view, but I talk about it just so you understand that ultimately this is what's going on in a biological system, is that there's a series of traits in mothers that each have some influence on the phenotype of their offspring. And so then this is however many traits exist in mothers that you've been measured in this framework. And this MI is the influence of maternal trait I on the trait in the offspring that we're looking at. You can think of this as a multiple regression model, if if you think statistically. That is, you're just trying to estimate a slope here of how offspring phenotype changes as a function of a bunch of different maternal traits. There can be problems with that because these two individuals are related to each other. We'll come back to that. So why do we care about maternal effects? I mean, early on maternal effects, people cared because of their influence on resemblance of relatives. And really, that was because people were worried about them as a nuisance factor. That is, they influence how siblings resemble each other, or parents and offspring resemble each other, but they do so in a way that classic quantitative geneticists hoped would go away somehow, or we could get rid of it because we weren't interested in it. But they are, of course, they have a genetic basis. They can think about them as genetically based environments. They're also ecological studies, and ecologists have been much more interested in maternal effects because of the fact that you have these environmental effects across generations. The environment affects mothers. That effect then is cascades onto the offspring because mothers affect their offspring. So you have this sort of ecological effect of environment in one generation can have effects in the next generation through maternal effects. I'll talk about each of these in turn. But the primary reason I think most people now worry about maternal effects from an evolutionary perspective is because maternal effects themselves can evolve and contribute to the response to selection. So they're not a nuisance factor that you necessarily want to remove. They can be an important factor that actually contributes to, say, trait evolution. So I'll talk a bit about resemblance of relatives because that's, I think, a point where if people are studying this empirically, you might want to know a bit about how we understand maternal effects from the perspective of resemblance of relatives. So the classic view of like what would we want to know if we were studying resemblance of relatives? Well, we generally want to know to what degree do individuals that share genes resemble each other, right? So that's a classic quantitative genetics problem. And that will give you things like narrow sense or broad sense heritability depending on what type of relatives you're looking at the resemblance of, to what degree they look alike. And so the idea is, of course, that individuals, so I've written out, and I'll do this in the next few, we have some individual here, has its phenotype, has some genes and experiences some environment, and there's some other individual, and I've marked this with 2 primes here, and just to keep track of that this and these are different individuals. It has its own genes, it has some environment and experiences. Classically, we'd want to say, well, these 2 individuals resemble each other because there's some relationship between the genes that they have. So that's what gives you, say, heritability. So, but if we look at a set of siblings, right, 2 individuals that share a mother, what you find is that this individual here has, its genes and environments, but it experiences a maternal effect. This other individual that we'll say it's its sibling has a genotype that's correlated to the first individual's genotype because they share parents, so they have similar genotypes. But they also experience the same maternal effect because they have the same mother. And so therefore, these 2 phenotypes are correlated both because of the shared genes they have, but also because of the shared maternal effect. Which, that's all it just says in words. I'll flip to click. And so if we look at this, the degree to which those 2 individuals are going to resemble each other because of a maternal effect is proportional to how important a maternal effect is. What is the variance in maternal effects? So that's just, I've written this out as P and M. There's a reason why there's 2 subscripts that we won't worry about just yet, but P is the phenotypic variance for maternal effects. So 2 individuals that are siblings are going to resemble each other to a degree to which maternal effects contribute variation. And that can be genetic or non-genetic. That's just to what degree are maternal effects in a broad sense important. They're going to make siblings look alike. So you can think about this as why do these 2 individuals resemble each other? Well, again, they have correlated genes. That might be what people classically were interested in. But they share a mother. So this is just, I've written out the maternal effect, which are the genes in the mother and the environment experienced by the mother influence this individual's phenotype and the influence this individual's phenotype. So these individuals resemble each other because they have a shared maternal effect. But just because they resemble each other through a maternal effect doesn't mean you know whether it's because the maternal effect had a genetic basis or had an environmental basis. So that's the reason why people have traditionally been trying to remove and ignore maternal effects is because you don't know where they come from. You don't know whether or not they're genetic in origin or environmental in origin. You just know that 2 individuals that share a mother will resemble each other in proportion to how important the maternal effect is, not necessarily to what degree the maternal effect has a genetic or an environmental basis. So if we look at this and we ask, so there'll be a few, it's quantitative genetics, we always come back to a few equations, but I'll try to make them conceptual instead of worrying about like all the bits and pieces, just to say, we can look at the resemblance of two individuals here, we can look at the resemblance by measuring the covariance between siblings. To what degree does the phenotype of an individual resemble the phenotype of its siblings? We do that across the population. So you see the covariance of individuals that are siblings for the same trait. Well, they're going to resemble each other if they're full sibs, that is they share a mother and a father, in relationship to the genetic variance. And it'd be half the genetic variance because they share half their genes. So that's, again, classic quantitative genetic solution. They'll resemble each other because of maternal effects. Again, that's the variance in maternal effects. And they'll resemble each other to the degree that their genes are correlated to the maternal effect. So there's this extra term, which is the covariance between the genes you have and the maternal effect you experience will increase the degree to which siblings resemble each other. So again, that's just writing out to what degree a sibling is going to look alike. These terms would go away if there are no maternal effects. And so the idea in classic quantitative genetics is that siblings resemble each other in proportion to the amount of shared genes, and that, depending on your assumptions about the type of genes, is somehow related to half of the genetic variance or additive genetic variance in this case. But let's not worry about the specifics, just to say that that's what a classic model, maternal effects, add some terms. So the problem, as I said, is with full siblings, right, you cannot tell direct from maternal effects as a source of resemblance. If you went out and you measured individuals in a population, you said, look, siblings look alike, therefore the trait's heritable, I would say, well, no, you don't know that. Siblings look alike can be entirely because of a shared maternal effect, and the maternal effect could have no genetic basis. It can be entirely that both individuals that end up growing up in a nest together look alike because mothers built a specific quality nest in a specific location. There's a maternal effect, but there can be no genetic basis to the resemblance. It can be entirely because they just happen to be in the same maternally provided environment, the same local environment. So that's a problem. If you took half-sibs, individuals that share a father but don't share a mother, then make sure I'm doing this in the right order. So individuals that share the same mother but not the same father would look more alike than individuals that share the same father but not the same mother, right? So you're saying that a maternal effect in general would make individuals with shared mothers more similar than individuals with shared fathers. So you can do that in a design. It still doesn't tell you whether or not the maternal effects themselves are genetic in origin, but at least would tell you to what degree are maternal effects versus what we call direct effects, the influence of the individual's own genotype on its phenotype, important. So if you're to do this, and you're asked, well, okay, let's take individuals that share a father but not a mother. What would the covariance of their phenotypes be? What would their resemblance be? It would be approximately a quarter of the additive genetic variance. So this is ignoring the small terms of epistatic effects and whatnot here. We'll just assume that that's approximately equal to a quarter. So that's why people use paternal half-sib designs, because the solution for the covariance of siblings that share a father is a quarter of the additive variance. Now, if you ask, what about individuals that share a mother but not a father? Well, what you see is that those individuals still have this problem that they resemble each other because of maternal effects. The difference between these two would give you an estimate of the degree to which maternal effects are important, but it would confound both the maternal effects and the genetic covariance between direct and maternal effects. It's a minor point. The major point is to say this difference here, the fact that you have these extra terms when you look at individuals with a shared mother but not a shared father, is one way in which you could differentiate maternal effects from direct effects. The way that's been handled in a lot of, especially the mammalian literature and to a lesser degree bird literature, is cross-fostering, where say you take biological full sibs, but you take some of them and you give them to another mother. So they're not related to their mother, so they shouldn't have this relationship to their mother. Well, so now I've introduced, so we still have our two individuals here that we're looking at. But what you'll see is that this mother is different from this mother. So say what we've done is we've taken half of the litter, we've given it to one mother, we've taken another half of the litter, we've given it to another mother. And then we ask, do these two individuals resemble each other from these two different, say, half litters, the ones raised by one mother versus a different mother? So that's some other mother there. So we say different foster mothers here. Well, the resemblance of those siblings, if all the maternal effects occurred after cross-fostering, which is an important point that I'll come back to, they would resemble each other because of shared genes, because they're raised by different mothers in separate nests. The only reason they should look alike, if you've done this fostering before maternal effects arise, should be due to genes. So that's why cross-fostering is really attractive in a lot of systems. And if you want to get rid of maternal effects, you can come up with a design where you just stick individuals with different mothers and ask about their resemblance. So what about, we'll go through a couple of other scenarios just to talk about the fact that you can take lots of different scenarios, and between them you can start to understand more about the genetic basis of these effects. So here's two individuals that are unrelated, but they're raised by the same mother, right? So now when you've done this cross-fostering scheme, you end up with, say, two half litters in the same nest that aren't related to each other, but they're being raised by the same mother. So here's the same mother. So all these other terms should be uncorrelated, and they should be related solely through the fact that they share a mother. And so therefore, if you did that, you could just estimate the general importance of maternal effects. This is the reason why two individuals raised by the same mother, but are unrelated to each other and unrelated to their mother, they should look alike simply because they're raised by the same mother. So that gives you an estimate of the maternal effects. But again, there's no genes here, right? So think about this as it just tells you to what degree are maternal effects important. You don't know whether or not they're genetic or environmentally based maternal effects. You just know to what degree are maternal effects important. So you can do some other designs. Here's a set of siblings that are raised by the same foster mother. So these two individuals are related to each other, so they share genes. They're raised by the same mother, but they're not raised by their mother. They're raised by some other mother. So there's no relationship between their genes and their mother's genes because they're not related to the foster mother that raises them. You get another expression where they resemble each other because they share genes and because they share a maternal effect. But what's missing is this other term that we saw earlier, which is the fact that their genes are correlated to the genes of their mother, this covariance term. So here's what we saw earlier. If we had siblings raised by their own mother, right, they would resemble each other because they share genes, they have a shared maternal effect, and their genes are correlated to the maternal effect that they experience. So this difference here, if you had a set of siblings raised by the same mother that they're not related to, and siblings that are raised by the same mother that they are related to, the difference in those resemblance of relatives would tell you how important the genetic covariance between direct and maternal effects are. So the point is you could come up with all sorts of different cross-fostering regimes where different resemblances of relatives and different combinations with their own mother, with a different mother, will start to allow you to pick apart the importance of their own genes, the environment provided by their mother, the correlation between their genes and the genes in their mother, this direct maternal genetic covariance. To what degree those are important, you can start to pull apart. Now, so that's been done, and again I emphasize, all of that doesn't tell you anything, again, about to what degree maternal effects have a genetic basis. So to me, they all provide you some general information on the importance of maternal effects, but provide very little information on the evolutionary importance of maternal effects in the sense of the genetic basis. But the other important thing to keep in mind is that cross-fostering only works if you can do it before there's a maternal effect. So there's been a whole literature of cross-fostering studies, say, in mammals, but the problem is that the individual has already spent a large amount of time in utero and has accumulated maternal effects. So even if you swap them at birth and you say, oh, look, siblings at 1 week of age look a lot alike, even if they're raised by other mothers, well, it's not surprising because they probably have this shared prenatal maternal environment. And you can't get rid of that unless you do embryo transfer, which is extraordinarily difficult and I thought of doing this years ago, and Bill Ashley, who had done a bunch, said, yeah, just don't do it. It's incredibly difficult, and it's actually pretty gruesome. So it's a problem. I mean, in birds, maybe you think that if you swap eggs between nests early enough before anything happens, maybe that works. But if you think about in plants where the embryo is attached to the seed, and you can't really cross-foster them before the seed has an effect, you're stuck in a situation where you can't achieve a separation. And so that just essentially says what I've just said. And so therefore, you have this problem that you can't necessarily easily separate direct and maternal effects because of the fact that you can't always cross-foster early enough. You also have the problem that even if you do all that, you don't know if the maternal effects are genetic, right? So you want to know maybe to what degree are there genetically based maternal effects that will contribute to, say, long-term evolution of some trait, because you can improve, say, maternal performance, have mothers improve in terms of their influence on some trait in the offspring that you're interested in. But as I said, resemblance of most types of relatives are influenced by the total maternal effect, not just by the genetically based maternal effect. Right, so you can actually separate genetically based maternal effects, and in some big agricultural systems where you have long pedigrees that are complex, or natural populations where people have constructed huge pedigrees, you can start to look at certain types of relationships that get the general importance of maternal genetic effects. But in an experimental setting, it's very difficult. And even from those sort of long-term pedigrees, the estimates are often not very good. So for example, you could compare maternal cousins to paternal cousins in the sense that you have two individuals who have mothers that are cousins versus another set of individuals that have fathers that are cousins. Well, the resemblance should be equal, except for if there's a genetically based maternal effect, the two individuals raised by mothers that themselves are related to each other should be more similar than two individuals raised by, well, or at least produced by fathers that are related. So you can go through these pedigrees and get an estimate of genetically based maternal effects, but that's not been done nearly as many times as people have just estimated the overall importance of maternal effects. So that's just, again, the point we just made. And what I'll come back to in this later on is, or you can use an approach that actually directly tries to measure the influence of maternal genotype on offspring phenotype, what we call a mapping approach. As I mentioned before, you also, sometimes you're interested in the fact that you have these cross-generational environmental effects. And that's, again, there's been a huge growth of literature in maternal effects from ecological perspective. And that ecological perspective has really been interested in these cross-generational environmental effects. And so if you look at a lot of the literature, and especially in non-model organisms, things like lizards and birds, they've been interested in to what degree mothers experience some environment. They shift their maternal effect. Maybe they alter where they lay eggs, or they shift what they put into the eggs that has a maternal effect, so that their environment determines their maternal effect. And so a lot of the studies are actually interested in the fact that you have these environments experienced in generation T-1 that have their influence in generation T. Sometimes people think about that as buffering or sort of helping predict. If you have environments that change very slowly, then mothers have some information about the environment that has some environmental influence on them that they pass along to their offspring, that sort of prepares their offspring for the environment they experienced. So if you have these very slowly cycling environments, maybe this is very good to have this situation where the maternal effect is changed based on the environment that has an influence on the next generation that kind of is appropriate for this sort of temporally local environment that's going to be happening for some time. So lots of factors like that. So I shouldn't say, from an evolutionary perspective, maybe we're mostly interested in these genetically based maternal effects, but if you went out and looked at a literature on maternal effects, you'd actually find a massive amount of information in ecological journals that are actually interested in this, and that's not really what I'm talking about, because those kind of factors have a different set of implications. And so just one of the things you can think about is that can be environmental inertia. So environmental influences in one generation carry over to the next, carry over to the next. They can have these sort of multi-generational environmental influences as the environment changes the maternal effect. And as I said, they can potentially the adaptive means of transmitting environmental information across generations. So let's look at the evolutionary consequences, because that's where we're really focused in terms of maternal genetic effects and the genetic perspective. Some studies talk about maternal effects, and I can understand why, as sort of a hidden source of genetic variation. Meaning you have genes and offspring, and you think, well, a lot of times if you look at sort of strict narrow sense heritability of, say, early body weight in a mammal or maybe a bird as well, I don't know anything about birds, but it might have very low heritability, which is not uncommon. But actually, a lot of that's because maternal effects have a huge contribution. And if you look at the genetic basis to, say, variation in early body size, you might think, oh, there's not much perspective for evolution of that trait because there's very little heritable variation. But maternal effects can have a genetic basis and can be this sort of hidden part that's not related directly to the individual's genotype, but it's related to the fact that the maternal effect that they experience can evolve. And in all these consequences, when we think about evolution, again, it's this case where genes in one individual have a phenotype in another individual, and so that generates a lot of the unusual outcomes of maternal effects, things like time lag between the origin of effects and when selection occurs that produces evolutionary, which we'll see momentum and time lags. But to me, the most important thing about the fact that there's genes in one individual, but a phenotype in another, is that maternal effects evolved by kin selection. Because if you imagine that selection is acting on offspring, that's going to change the maternal effect because those individuals' phenotype reflects the maternal effect genes they inherited. So we'll talk a bit about this kin selection idea. We can credit Jim Chevrolet for really pushing the origin of this idea of maternal effects evolving by kin selection. And I think that's the best way to think about them in terms of our understanding of how they contribute to various evolutionary processes. Well, let's think about this idea of a hidden source of variation. So what I mean is that if we're looking at the evolution, say long-term evolution of some trait in offspring, so some early, say, body size, or this could be pretty much any trait you're worried about, the classic breeder's equation that you might be familiar with would say that through time, this trait evolves in direct proportion to the evolution of the average genetic contribution to the trait. The sort of evolution of the breeding value if you don't rescale. But of course, with maternal effects, as I said, the individual's phenotype is the sum of its genetic effects and the influence of its mother. And if we just worry about through long term the fact that that component evolves because it also has a genetic basis, then the total evolutionary potential of some trait is both the evolutionary potential contributed by the genes of the individual and by the genes of the mothers, the maternal effect. And so this can, for lots of traits, be larger than this. And a lot of times we don't see this when we study genetic effects of traits. So it's sort of hidden, but the most, I think, elegant example of that is the work from Alex Badiev on house sparrows or house finches, where it showed that essentially much of the evolution of important traits comes from, rapid evolution comes from this, not this component. As I mentioned, one of the other things are evolutionary time lags. These tend to occur in agricultural studies where a system is not at equilibrium. And so selection in one generation shifts maternal effects, but the response to that selection is not seen until the next generation where those individuals experience a shifted set of maternal effects. And so if you think about really what happens in short-term evolution is that changes in the mean trait value are going to reflect changes in the average genetic contribution and changes in the maternal traits, regardless of their basis, whether they're genetic or not. And when that happens, these changes are occurring in generation T-1, but these changes are occurring in the next generation. So selection in the last generation has this carryover effect by shifting maternal effects to the next generation. And so there's a couple of the examples that spell this out, and these are really adaptations of the early idea that I largely credit to Falconer, but this is from Kirkpatrick and Landy, 1989, their maternal effects paper, where you have some maternal trait that has a negative influence on that same trait in offspring. So it might be something about body size in mothers that has some maternal influence on body size in the offspring, but it's negative. And that's from, at least from the original studies going back to Falconer, something that is believed to happen in certain strains of mice where big mothers have small kids, and you get this negative maternal effect. So if you think about a negative maternal effect, that means the change, you might not be able to see this, it's not that important. The change in the maternal trait is going to be influenced by current selection, and then the response to selection in the previous generation. And so what they showed is that if you start a selection regime where all you have is this negative response, so think about like you select for bigger body size, so you select the biggest mothers to begin with, they have small kids, and so you get this negative response to selection in the beginning because there's this negative maternal effect. So that gives you both an evolutionary timeline, but also the possibility of responding in the wrong direction to selection, which has been seen in mice where you get this. This will eventually, as you continue selection, equilibrate, and you'll get a response to selection. This will keep going, except for if you stop selection, then you get this rebound effect, you get this time lag, and the opposite, where you aren't selecting anymore, and so then you get this big bounce back effect. And so that's a peculiar thing that's been seen in artificial selection studies caused by maternal effects, but is not believed to necessarily be that important in the long term, because once selection reaches sort of steady state, meaning you have the same selection happening every generation, you get sort of the predicted linear response to selection. And as I said, this would just keep going as the system equilibrated. This current selection and past selection are the same. The system will still kind of keep responding in the same way, but when you start and end selection, you get these time lags and responses in the wrong direction. You can also, from that same phenomenon, get evolutionary momentum. So this is a case of a positive maternal effect. Say, big mothers have big kids, which might happen in lots of mammals. Not only because they have genes to make their kids big, but big mothers have, say, a bigger capacity for larger birth weight babies, and therefore there's a positive maternal effect. Well, if that happens, you'll start selecting, selection responses in the right direction, but when you stop selecting, you get a momentum. Because big mothers are having big babies that are becoming big mothers or having big babies, and that slowly erodes as there's no more selection happening. So you get this decay happening because you're slowly losing this past response to selection that keeps. You can imagine that early response to selection changes the phenotypes in the next generation, that changes the phenotypes in the next generation, and that slowly fades away as you stop selection. So let's also come back to this idea of kin selection. As I said, you can't really understand the evolution of maternal effects without understanding that they evolved by kin selection. And so, if we think about our offspring phenotype, it reflects their genes, the environment they experience, and the genes and environments that their mother has experienced. So that's their mother's genes and the environment experienced by their mother. So we've given them a little prime to indicate that's another individual, and they're in generation T minus 1. Well, if we select on offspring traits, part of what we're selecting on is their own genes, but of course they're going to inherit some of these genetic effects. So selection in offspring is not only going to shift the distribution of direct effects, that genes that directly affect the phenotype, but it's also going to shift the distribution of maternal effect genes, because these individuals will inherit some of these genes that affected their phenotype. So this is the kin selection part. The fact that selection on this phenotype in offspring will change the distribution of maternal effect genes. And so I'll try to reinforce that idea so it makes sense. The idea is that mothers influence traits in their offspring, then the offspring inherits some of those genes that have influenced their phenotype. So their phenotype reflects, to some degree, the maternal effect genes that their mother had, because they inherited them. So their phenotype is going to be correlated to the maternal effect they experienced. Their genotype is going to be correlated to the maternal effect they experienced. So if I select on offspring, I'm going to be partly selecting on maternal effect genes, or genetic influences from mothers. And that's again in words. And so if we think about that, well, what's the covariance? What's the degree to which the offspring's phenotype is correlated to their own maternal effect genes? Right? So I said that these individuals are going to be inheriting some of these genes from their mother. Well, we ask, what is the covariance between the maternal effect genes that the individual has and their own phenotype? Well, we have a term here which is that this individual inherits half of this genetic effect from their mother. So we have this term here that says, well, the individual's phenotype is going to reflect the maternal effect experience by 1/2 of the genetic variance for maternal effects. That's this covariance between the input, essentially the covariance of this term with their genotype. And then there's going to be this extra term that we keep seeing, which is the fact that the individual's phenotype is correlated to their maternal effect genotype because there's a covariance between the direct effects and maternal effects. But this is the one that we would traditionally think of in terms of kin selection, which is this individual's phenotype reflects the maternal effect genes they experience, weighted by the coefficient of relatedness. You inherit half your genes from your mother, so your phenotype reflects your mother's genotype weighted by 1/2, essentially. So then if we select on, if we have selection, okay, that's not the one I want to come up, but if we have selection acting on some trait in offspring, and we ask, how does the maternal effect evolve in response to selection on the kids? So we're selecting on the offspring, but we want to now know how does that kin selection lead to evolution of the maternal effect? So we ask, how does the maternal effect evolve in response to selection on offspring? So that's the evolution by kin selection. Well, we get an ordinary correlated response to selection, which is if you select on some offspring trait, it'll drive the maternal effect if the maternal effect is genetically correlated to the offspring trait. It's an ordinary correlated response to selection that you would see in quantitative genetics, right? The correlated response. But you have this kin selection component, which is when you select on the offspring, the maternal trait evolves by kin selection, because the offspring trait reflects the maternal effect genes an individual has. So when you select on it, you drive the maternal effect. So that's this response to kin selection. So then what you find is at equilibrium, you have the total evolution of the offspring trait. So if we go now from the maternal trait, which is here, to the offspring trait, what we find is that the offspring trait will evolve by evolution of the maternal effect and the fact that the direct effect evolves. So if we ignored this bit here, this would be evolution of the direct effect would be what we would find in a ordinary model. And we would, yeah. The thing that there's a little bit that is a little misleading here. So we'll just think about it in terms of these two components. The fact that there's the evolution of the maternal effect and the evolution of the direct effect together are going to determine evolution of the trait without worrying about the pieces. And just the last thing to give you lots of complicated mathematics before we move on. Selection, if you have selection on the offspring phenotype and on the maternal effect, you get this complex response to selection that has to do with the fact that offspring trait is evolving both because of the fact that direct effects are evolving and the maternal effect is evolving, as opposed to the classic two-trait breeders equation where your phenotype this trait would evolve because selection acts on it and selection acts on correlated traits. So that's the direct response to selection, this is the correlated response to selection. With maternal effects you get a much more complex response, and the extra pieces here are all caused by this kin selection component, the fact that you have this evolution of the maternal effect occurring. What was the last thing I was going to say? We'll just skip the last bit on that. And the last thing I'll say is that if you want to think about then maternal effects evolving by kin selection, what we often think about is this in terms of Hamilton's rule. So you might be familiar with Hamilton's rule, the idea that altruistic traits evolve if the cost divided by the benefit is less than the coefficient of relatedness. Well, you can get that out of maternal effect models to show how they relate to kin selection. Again, this is back to the Jim Chevron's models that have been adapted into other scenarios. But if we assume that maternal performance, something mothers are doing, are having a benefit to the kids, so maybe mothers are giving lots of milk, the kids are growing well, and that's good for kids. So so it's affecting the trait that's under positive selection in the kids, how fast they grow, so that's good. So the selection on the offspring trait is positive, but it's costly, so there's negative selection on the maternal trait. So if you think about, well, mothers that give lots of milk, maybe they have a fitness cost, so there's negative selection on this maternal trait. You can get a Hamilton's rule, And it's clearest if you essentially assume that selection acts on all adults and all offspring. Without going through the specifics, you're just asking, like Hamilton's rule, which is when does this maternal trait evolve in an altruistic direction? An altruistic direction would be mothers are providing more milk. When would that happen? Even though there's negative selection acting on that trait, because the direct fitness consequence of producing lots of milk is negative because you end up using up all your energy and you die, whereas of course it benefits your kids, so that's good. But when does that evolve in an altruistic direction? And you can take this evolutionary response to selection equation from maternal effects and rearrange it to get a Hamilton's rule that says when is the response positive, and you get this solution here which says when the cost divided by the benefit, right? So the cost is this cost to mothers divided by the benefit to their offspring. When that's greater than 1/2, which is the coefficient of relatedness, that would be Hamilton's rule, right? The cost divided by the benefit is less than the coefficient of relatedness. And you get an extra term, which is related to the fact that the cost and benefit, the genetic basis for the cost and benefit are correlated, and so you can't separate the two when you understand Hamilton's rule, so that's a bit of extra. But if you just, we don't worry about that so much, just to say that you can understand how maternal traits evolve even through, say, Hamilton's rule by using maternal effects theory to ask when do maternal traits evolve in an altruistic direction. So that's a useful solution. So as I said, you can think about that. If the maternal effect and the direct effect are independent, then you get Hamilton's rule. So we just sort of think about a summary of some of these ideas. We see that maternal effects increase the resemblance of relatives sharing a mother, right? And that's regardless of whether the maternal effect arises from genetic or environmental influences. Like, stress that, because lots of people go out and study maternal effects, and we still don't know very much about the genetic basis to it because of this constraint. You can separate direct and maternal effects and learn a bit more about them by using cross-fostering schemes, but that cross-fostering has to be done before there's a maternal effect, and even if you achieve that, you still are stuck with this first problem that you don't really necessarily know if they're genetically based. So there's a bit of a problem with studying them. Doesn't diminish their importance. These are caveats about the fact that they still can be a pain in the neck to study, but they can still be extraordinarily important. So it doesn't mean you therefore ignore them. That's not the point. And you can see that they can contribute an additional component to evolutionary change as the maternal effects evolve that can drive the evolution of some interesting traits in offspring. And I should say, this could be the most important part of the evolution of some trait in offspring. It could be entirely through the evolution of maternal effects. So that is, you might think they're hard to study, we can't study them, so we ignore them, and yet they contribute a component, but that could be the biggest or a very large component to evolutionary change. So therefore, we don't want to necessarily ignore them because they're a pain in the neck to study, because they can be extraordinarily important. As I mentioned, from sort of an ecological perspective, they can allow environmental effects or information in one generation to pass to the next generation through the action of maternal effects, even if they have an environmental basis. And as I said, maternal effects evolve by kin selection. And maybe the way to think about this, instead of worrying about sort of the kin selection theory that I showed you, is to simply think about the fact that we're assuming that a lot of the evolution of maternal effects occur by the fact that offspring survive or don't survive very well, or have high or low, say, reproductive capacity because of the maternal effect they experienced. And therefore, a lot of the selection is actually acting indirectly on the maternal effect through its influence on the offspring. And that's what I mean by evolving by kin selection. And so I'll just end there, and we're going to come back to maternal effects, thinking about them from a genetic basis.
Don't you think it would be very different, the evolution of maternal effects based on the selection of the offspring, if the environment is like unpredictable? For example, if the offspring stay on the same environment as the mother, they would have an increase in fitness. But if it stay on a different environment, like less food or something, it wouldn't pass on to their offspring the previous maternal effects.
Yeah, so a lot of the people, there have been models, especially recently, of people trying to understand when will a system, if you allow a system to evolve variation to be determined by the individual's genotype or by their mother. So you say, like, let's just allow a trait to evolve from being controlled by your own genotype to the genotype of your mother. And ask, are there situations where maternal effects will be, actually the mode of inheritance will evolve to become maternal effect versus direct effect. what you find is that the scenario you describe, where the information essentially provided by the environment experienced by the mother on their offspring is not reliable, then of course the maternal effect will evolve to become less important. So you have to think it's essentially comes down to the correlation between the environment that the offspring experience and the environment the mother experiences, either because the environment it's everywhere but it's changing slowly through time, so everyone experiences, or it has very high local correlation, like the offspring don't disperse very much, or they're going to end up in a similar environment to what their mother experienced when she was having her maternal effect. So you find that essentially the system will try to, in the anthropomorphic sense, try to sort of get rid of the maternal effect if it's unreliable, because it's actually maladapted, because it's essentially providing the wrong information to the offspring. And so if you allow it to evolve in that scenario, then selection would favor essentially canalization of it so that it's not sensitive to the maternal effect. So you'll remove that. But it can also evolve the other way, so that the trait responds more to the maternal effect, because the maternal effect is actually adaptive, because it allows information to pass from one generation to the next that can make you more prepared for the environment than other individuals are. If their maternal effect wasn't, or they weren't responding to the maternal effect, they wouldn't be ready for this, say, drought environment, and therefore you'll have higher fitness if you respond to the maternal effect. So it's an important scenario, but to some degree the evolutionary models assume here's a maternal effect, what's its influence, and another set of models say, well, when will you expect to find a maternal effect? And so that question is more about when do you expect to find a maternal effect, and then these scenarios are more about if there is one, what does it do? But of course the two are happening simultaneously.